Welcome to Secrets of Ancient Cosmology, exploring the monad, dyad, and triad. Across many of the world's ancient philosophical and religious traditions, the nature of reality was described through a sequence of fundamental principles represented by the numbers 1, 2, and 3. These were not merely numerical values, but metaphysical symbols used to answer a perennial question: how does unity give rise to multiplicity? The monad signified the original and undivided principle, the supreme one or source from which all existence flows. The dyad introduced distinction, polarity, or otherness. The emergence of a second term that makes relation, contrast, and movement possible. The triad then served as the mediating and generative resolution between the two, producing the structured multiplicity of the world. This pattern, from 1 to 2 to 3, and then to the 10,000 things of manifest reality, appears repeatedly across civilizations. While different traditions developed their own symbolic expressions, the underlying structure remains strikingly consistent. In Gnostic cosmology, the monad unfolds into paired emanations and eventually a triadic divine family. In Pythagorean and Platonic thought, the one and the indefinite dyad generate number and form, with the triad representing harmony and completeness. In Taoist cosmology, the Tao produces unity. Unity produces yin-yang duality, and the interplay of these produces the dynamic third that generates all phenomena. Though these frameworks differ in theology, tone, and metaphysical emphasis, they each articulate a similar logic of unfolding. Unity gives rise to duality, and duality achieves expression through a synthesizing third term. A key emblem of this progression appears in the Pythagorean tetractys, a triangular figure composed of 10 points arranged in rows of 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first row represents the monad or pure unity, the second, the dyad or the first differentiation, the third, the triad or the reconciliation of opposites, and the fourth, the tetrad symbolizing the formed cosmos. To the Pythagoreans, this figure contained the archetypal structure of reality itself, a symbolic map showing how the one becomes the many. Today, we will explore an examination of how this monad-dyad-triad sequence functions in three major contexts: Gnostic cosmology, where emanation from the monad generates divine hierarchies and, ultimately, the material world; Pythagorean and Platonic metaphysics, where the one and dyad serve as generative principles of number, form, and being; and Taoist cosmology, where unity divides into complementary forces whose dynamic harmony produces the living world. By comparing these traditions, we can see that the sequence from 1 to 2 to 3 is not a cultural accident, but a recurring conceptual grammar through which ancient thinkers sought to understand reality's structure and origin. The Gnostic monad as source and the first emanations. In Gnosticism, the concept of the monad features prominently as the ultimate, ineffable source of all being. Gnostic teachings, particularly from the 2nd century AD, describe a supreme father god beyond comprehension, often simply called the one or monad. For example, the Apocryphon of John portrays the monad as an absolute, self-sufficient existence, a monarchy with nothing above it. The invisible spirit, of whom it is not right to think of him as a god. This monad is the primal origin, perfect, imperishable, and containing within itself the totality of divine potential. From this transcendent one unfolds the Gnostic pleroma, or fullness, through a process of emanation. Early Gnostic teachers like Valentinus taught that the monad emanated a series of lesser divine beings called aeons, typically arranged in male-female pairs, or syzygies. The dyad in Gnostic cosmology often appears as the monad's first emanation or partnership, a second principle that allows creation to begin. Often this takes the form of a father and mother duo at the top of the spiritual world. For instance, some Valentinian texts describe the ineffable father and his ennoia, or thought or silence, as an initial dyad, whose union produces further aeons such as mind, or nous, and truth, themselves a dyadic pair. In one account preserved by Hippolytus, the father, alone as he was, emanated and generated mind and truth, that is to say, the Dyad, which is lady and beginning, mother of all, indicating that the first emanation of the monad was conceived as a divine father-mother pair, generating the rest of existence. Even when a Gnostic system does not explicitly personify the monad's consort, it often treats the monad as containing both masculine and feminine aspects within itself, an androgynous one, so that it can effectively become two and then create. After the monad and its initial dyad, Gnostic cosmologies describe a triad or trinity of principles. For example, in certain Sethian Gnostic texts, the primordial triad consists of the invisible spirit, or monad, its feminine emanation barbello, which is thought or foreknowledge, and a third principle, the autogenes or self-begotten son. This father-mother-child triad is seen as the first completion of the divine realm. Similarly, the Gnostic teacher Monoimus spoke of the world being created from the monad, which brings forth the duad, triad, tetrad, up to 10, effectively a numeric emanation sequence parallel to Pythagorean ideas. Monoimus explicitly identified his Gnostic aeons with the first 10 numbers. In Monoimus's view, the monad was both male and female and could produce the dyad, and subsequent numbers, on its own, whereas systems like Valentinianism posited a syzygy, or pair, at the start for creation to occur. It's important to note that Gnostics use these numerical concepts in a mythopoetic way. The monad of Gnosticism is not an abstract number, but a personal, spiritual absolute, often called the forefather or bythos, meaning depth, from which a plurality of divine emanations flows. The dyad might be personified as Mother Sophia or silence, and the triad as a first divine family of sorts. Through emanation, the one gradually unfolds into the many aeons, typically with ever-increasing multiplicity. For example, Valentinus described 30 aeons in the Pleroma, while Basilides spoke of 365 aeons, one for each day of the year. Each step from monad to dyad to triad to larger numbers represents the growing complexity of existence the further it gets from the singular perfection of the one. While some Gnostic systems emphasize rupture or distance as emanation proceeds outward from the monad, it is important to recognize that the dyad does not always signify a fall or deviation. In several Valentinian and Sethian configurations, the dyad represents a reflective or relational dimension internal to the divine fullness, an unfolding of the one into self-consciousness or self-articulation. The emergence of a second principle is therefore not initially an act of separation, but the necessary condition by which the ineffable becomes knowable. Only at later stages, when emanation proceeds toward the lower registers of being, does differentiation risk instability. The dyad, at its highest level, expresses complementarity rather than conflict, and can be understood as an essential feature of the divine pleroma rather than a departure from it. Critically, Gnosticism often draws a stark line between the spiritual fullness that emanates near the monad and the material creation far below. The monad itself remains in the highest light, while the material world is the result of a lower emanation, often personified as the demiurge, a creator figure ignorant of the monad. In many versions, the lowest aeon, Sophia or wisdom, falls or produces an anomaly that leads to the formation of the physical cosmos. Thus the monad is absolutely transcendent and not directly involved in creating matter, a task left to the emanated powers. This dualism between the perfect one and the flawed material realm is a hallmark of Gnostic thought. The key point, however, is that the Gnostics adopted the language of monad, dyad, triad, to describe the ontological steps from the ultimate Godhead down to the world. The monad as the true God, dyads as the first emanated principles, and triads as balanced relations, as described in the tripartite tractate. The Church Father Hippolytus even remarked that Gnostics borrowed this framework from the Pythagoreans, who taught that the first thing that came into existence was the monad, which begat the dyad, which begat the numbers, which begat the point. In other words, the Gnostics adapted the ancient philosophical concept of a primordial one unfolding into multiplicity, giving it a mythological and religious spin. Pythagorean and Platonic views, cosmic numbers and principles. Long before the rise of Gnosticism, we find the seeds of these ideas in Pythagorean and Platonic philosophy. The Pythagorean school, from the 6th to 5th century BC, revered numbers as the fundamental reality, and they gave special status to 1, 2, and 3 as the building blocks of a four-dimensional creation. In Pythagorean cosmology, the monad was the first principle, the origin of all things, and the indefinite dyad was the second principle, associated with matter or plurality. Ancient Pythagorean doctrine states, the first principle of all things is the monad. From the monad comes the indefinite dyad, subsisting as matter in relation to the monad, which is cause. And from the monad and the dyad come the numbers. From the numbers, points. From points, lines. From lines, two-dimensional shapes. From two dimensions, three-dimensional forms. And from these, the perceptible bodies from which the cosmos is formed. Here we see a clear stepwise emanation. The one gives rise to two, which gives rise to number, then geometry, and finally the physical elements. The monad in this view is essentially unity, or the divine one, and the dyad is the first division, sometimes described as the unlimited or the principle of diversity that the one generates. Pythagoreans often called the monad and dyad by other names, for example, bound and infinity, the monad being the limiting, defining principle, and the dyad the limitless openness or chaos that needs form. Through their interaction, all definite things emerge. The triad, or three, was likewise sacred to the Pythagoreans as the first whole number, beyond the polarity of two. They saw the number 3 as signifying harmony and completeness, the union of thesis and antithesis into synthesis. In the Pythagorean view, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals 10, and this decad of 10 was the perfect number encompassing the entire universe. The special status of the triad is further clarified when considered in geometric terms. 1 point has no extension, 2 points establish only a line of pure directionality, but 3 points define a plane, introducing the possibility of stable form. The triad therefore marks the threshold at which structure becomes possible. Where the monad symbolizes unity and the dyad polarity, the triad signifies the first condition of coherence, an arrangement capable of sustaining proportion, harmony, and measure. This geometric significance underlies the Pythagorean reverence for the triad, and explains why it is regarded not merely as a midpoint between one and many, but as the generative principle through which ordered reality is made thinkable. The famous Pythagorean tetractys is a triangular arrangement of 4 rows of dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, which add up to 10. The rows correspond to the monad, dyad, triad, and tetrad, and the Pythagoreans imbued this diagram with deep cosmological meaning. According to later Pythagorean sources, the first row, or monad, symbolizes unity, the divine one. The second row, or dyad, symbolizes power or expansion, sometimes described as the limit and unlimited duality. The third row, or triad, symbolizes harmony, and the fourth, the tetrad, symbolizes the cosmos itself. In geometrical terms, these numbers correspond to dimensions. 1 is a point, 2 points make a line, 3 points define a plane or triangle, and 4 points can define a three-dimensional figure, a tetrahedron. So, the triad, coming after 1 and 2, introduces the plane, a metaphor for solidity or reality taking shape, and generally represents the mediating stage that produces stable structures. For instance, in music, the Pythagoreans recognized the harmonic triad. We also find that the Pythagoreans associated the number 3 with concepts of harmonia, the fitting together of opposites, which is quite fitting for a number that stands between the polar 2 and the solid 4. To the Pythagoreans, these numbers were not just quantities but living principles of reality. The monad was often equated with deity or the all, the supreme being or totality of all things, and the dyad with audacity, the daring separation from the one, or with matter itself. The triad, as the first product of 1 and 2, represented the mixing. For example, the Pythagorean table of opposites needed a third reconciliatory term in many cases, like a chord's 3 notes. In their mystical oath, Pythagoreans even addressed the tetractys with reverence. "Bless us, divine number, thou who generated gods and men, O holy, holy tetractys." For the divine number begins with the profound, pure unity until it comes to the holy 4. Then it begets the mother of all, the all-comprehending, all-bounding, the firstborn Holy Ten. This shows that the progression 1, 2, 3, 4, monad, dyad, triad, tetrad, was understood to generate gods and men, the entire order of existence. In short, Pythagorean cosmology provides an explicit template of reality emerging from the monad to dyad to triad, with each stage having metaphysical significance. Platonic philosophy inherited and modified many of these ideas. Plato himself, in his later unwritten teachings, reportedly spoke of the one and the indefinite dyad as the ultimate principles behind the forms and the material world. While the specifics are arcane, Aristotle attests that Plato essentially posited a monad, the one, identified with the good, and a dyad, an indeterminate, great and small, as a dual origin for the universe, a clear philosophical echo of Pythagorean number metaphysics. These ideas were further developed by later Platonists and Neo-Pythagoreans. For example, the philosopher Numenius, 2nd century AD, argued that Pythagoras' first principles were an independent monad and dyad. He described the monad as the supreme god, simple and at rest, and the dyad as the chaotic matter or second god, comparable to a demiurge, that generates the world by division. Here we already see a triadic structure. Numenius spoke of three gods: the first god, monad, a second god who interacts with the dyad, demiurge, nous, and the world that ensues. These ideas culminated in Neoplatonism, 3rd century AD, where we see an explicit monad-dyad-triad interpretation in a more abstract philosophical form. The great Neoplatonist Plotinus taught that reality emanates from a supreme one, through a divine mind, into a world soul. Plotinus describes three foundational hypostases: the one, intellect, nous, and soul. The one of Plotinus is an absolute monad, an utterly simple unity beyond being, akin to a mystical ultimate principle. From the one emanates the intellect, which is the realm of divine thought, essentially a dyad, in the sense that within intellect there is a knower and known, a subject-object duality. Plotinus noted that intellect is a one-many, because it contains all the forms or ideas multiplicity within itself. Finally, from intellect emanates the soul, which in Plotinus's system is a principle that both includes the world soul, animating the cosmos, and individual souls. This can be seen as a third that mediates between the intelligible and the physical. Thus, Plotinus's cosmology is fundamentally triadic: monad to intellectual dyad to manifested triad. We can compare. Plotinus's one corresponds to the Pythagorean monad. His intellect, containing multiplicity, corresponds to the unfolding of the dyad numbers, and the soul corresponds to the formed world. In fact, Neoplatonists like Iamblichus and Proclus would later expand Plotinus's system into nested triads, seeing triadic patterns at each level of reality. Plotinus himself was aware of Gnostic ideas and criticized the Gnostics for, in his view, mischaracterizing the one and its emanations. He held that the one is absolutely simple and good, and does not willfully create a flawed world as some Gnostics suggested. Nonetheless, even in his polemic, Plotinus is operating with the same conceptual toolkit of a supreme monad, giving rise to a secondary principle and a tertiary one. The philosophical triad of one new soul thus parallels the theological triads and numerological models we see elsewhere, but in a more impersonal and intellectualized manner. It's noteworthy that later Christian mystics would merge this line of thought with theology, speaking of one divine ousia in three hypostases, essentially a monad that is also triad, as in the doctrine of the Trinity. This shows the enduring influence of the monad-triad idea. Medieval thinkers cited Hermes Trismegistus' axiom, "A monad can only beget a monad," to describe the Father begetting the Son, and saw the love between them as forming a trinity. Taoist and other ancient perspectives: one becomes two becomes three. Interestingly, the 1-2-3 schema is not unique to the Mediterranean world. It appears in other ancient traditions, though expressed in different terms. Taoist cosmology in ancient China, for example, provides a striking parallel. Chapter 42 of the Tao Te Ching famously states, "Tao produced one, 1 produced 2, 2 produced 3, 3 produced the 10,000 things. In this aphorism by Laozi, the Tao, or Tao, is the primordial reality, an unnameable source akin to a monad. Tao is often described as the formless, unitary origin of heaven and earth. From the Tao arises the One, which we can interpret as the first differentiation. Some commentators equate this one with Qi, the primal energy, or with Taiji, the great ultimate, essentially the initial unity of existence. The two refers to yin and yang, the fundamental dual poles, negative and positive, receptive and active, that emerge from the one. With two, the cosmos now has polarity, much like the appearance of a dyad. Then, two produced three, and this three in Taoist thought is often understood as the harmonious interplay of yin and yang. Laozi elaborates that all things carry yin and embrace yang, and through the blending of qi or breath and energy, they achieve harmony. That qi, or life force born from the balance of opposites, is essentially the third principle uniting the two. In some interpretations, three has been taken more concretely as heaven, earth, and humanity, the triad of the universe. But the most common reading is that 3 equals yin plus yang plus the balanced union between them. From this triad of forces, the text says, "Come the 10,000 things," which is a Chinese idiom for the myriad phenomena, or all of creation. Thus, Taoism presents a cosmogony, where an original oneness gives rise to two-ness, that is, cosmic duality, and then through their interaction, a third creative factor generates the multiplicity of the world. This bears a conceptual resemblance to the monad, dyad, triad sequences we've seen in Gnostic and Pythagorean systems. The flavor, however, is different. The Tao is an impersonal natural principle. Yin and yang are complementary opposites rather than a moral or gendered pair, and the three is an emergent harmony rather than an anthropomorphized trinity. Yet, the logical progression, unity to duality to trinity to infinity, is remarkably congruent. We even find Chinese sources correlating the numbers with these stages. For example, the Tongxuan, or Hua Hu Qing, attributed to Laozi, reiterates, 1 generates 2, 2 generates 3, 3 generates all things. And just as Pythagoreans saw the decad, meaning 10, as perfection, some Taoist commentators note that 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6, which, along with 4, representing Earth, makes 10, symbolizing completion. In the Chinese decimal cosmology, 10 symbolizes all, as in the 10 heavenly stems. Numerological speculation aside, the key idea is that the cosmos unfolds by first becoming dual and then triadic. This idea also appears in other cultures. For instance, in an ancient Vedic creation hymn, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the One Self, or Atman, is alone in the beginning, then splits itself into male and female, a dyad, as large as 2 halves of a split pea, in order to reproduce and give rise to the world's creatures. Here again, one had to become 2 to engender the many. In some Hindu philosophies, the dynamic of Purusha, meaning spirit, and Prakriti, meaning matter, a fundamental duality, is resolved by a third factor, the equilibrium of the 3 guna qualities. We see, time and again, a recognition that absolute unity, to create a world, must generate a complementary opposite, and then a relationship between the 2 and the third spawns multiplicity. Unity, duality, trinity as cosmic archetypes. Across these diverse systems, Gnostic, Pythagorean or Platonic, and Taoist among others, the notions of monad, dyad, and triad serve as a kind of metaphysical grammar for describing reality. There is a striking convergence in the idea that creation is a staged process. It begins from an original oneness, moves through a stage of two-ness or polarity, and then arrives at a third stage that unifies and creates multiplicity. The transition from 2 to 3 should not be understood as a subsequent repair of the instability introduced by duality, but rather as a structural inevitability inherent in the very existence of distinct terms. Once there is distinction, there is also relation, and relation itself is already a third principle. Thus, the triad is not a product that arrives after the dyad, but an implicit dimension that becomes formally explicit when the unity and polarity of the one and the two are recognized as dynamically interdependent. The triad names the relational intelligibility that allows differentiation to be coherent rather than chaotic. In this sense, the triad is the first true expression of ordered existence. This shared conceptual framework suggests that the human intellect, when grappling with the mystery of how does the many emerge from the one, has repeatedly gravitated to the numbers 1, 2, and 3 as symbolic answers. The enduring triadic pattern. The sequence from 1 to 2 to 3 is not merely a numerical progression, but a structural insight into how reality is conceived to arise. The monad signifies undivided origin. The dyad introduces contrast, distinction, or polarity. And the triad provides a mediating relation through which multiplicity becomes possible. Whether expressed through the mythic emanations of the Gnostic pleroma, the numerical metaphysics of the Pythagoreans and Platonists, or the natural cosmology of Taoist yin-yang dynamics, the same fundamental pattern appears. Unity must become differentiated to generate a world, and differentiation must be resolved through a harmonizing third principle for ordered existence to emerge. This recurrence suggests that the 1-2-3 sequence functions not as a local doctrine of any single culture, but as a cognitive and metaphysical model that ancient thinkers across civilizations found necessary for explaining the transition from absolute unity to the complexity of lived reality. Each tradition shaped the terms and implications of this pattern according to its own theological, philosophical, and cosmological aims, yet the underlying structure remains consistent. By recognizing this shared architecture, we gain a clearer view into how ancient thought approached the problem of origins. Creation is not a sudden leap from one to many, but a graded unfolding in which unity generates polarity, and polarity achieves coherence through a synthesizing third. The monad, dyad, and triad therefore stand as enduring archetypes through which human reflection has sought to understand how the world comes to be, and how the many can never be fully separated from the one.